Monroe area, and superintendent over there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, they are.
Yeah. And the better, or whatever, if it's done like.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Y'all are good.
Thanks, have a nice spread.
Good spread.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I am Karen Howell, Deputy Assistant Superintendent for the Office of Early Childhood Care and Education here at the Louisiana Department of Education. And on behalf of the Early Childhood Care and Education Commission Task Force, I call this meeting to order. Please note that we are live streaming today's meeting, so there are no microphones in front of you, but there are some above us, so we will try to minimize our side discussions so that there's clear communication through those microphones for those who are joining us online. To begin our meeting today, I would like to ask Brittany Cochran to call the roll. May we have a roll call, please, Brittany?
Yes. Dr. Stephen Barnes,
Here.
Melissa Gudo, Representative Barbara Freiberg, Ruth Lawson, Senator Beth Mizell, Jan Moeller,
Here.
Stephen Procopio. It's a lot here for Stephen Procopio. Dr. Libby Saunier. I'm going back to her. Michael Tipton.
Here.
Thank you very much, Brittany. All right, a meeting without a quorum of the membership present does not constitute a meeting in which business can be conducted and motions will not be recorded. However, the department will present the information outlined on the agenda for discussion among the members present, and public comment will be accepted. So with us today, we have Abby McCartney again from Afton Partners. I know that I've had her present to us before, and she is here to bring back a draft of a formula to share with our group today. I will, without further ado, turn it over to you.
Yeah, wonderful. Great to be with you all. For those who I haven't seen in a while, I'm Abby. I am a senior director at Afton Partners. We've been working with the department and other folks and you all across the state for a little over a year, working through this idea of a funding formula for early childhood. So the first thing we're going to do today is just kind of remind ourselves where we've been, because it's been a little while. I think I was last with this group in July. So we'll kind of go back through that process briefly and the recommendations that came out of it, just to kind of jog our memories. And then, as Karen said, we've been working on a tool that is sort of the foundation of a funding formula. It's very early in early stages. There's a lot still to build out and a lot to refine. But we wanted to share it with you all as a kind of initial step into what this could look like. So we'll actually flip over to that Excel tool and I'll show you some things that it can do now, and then you can tell me what else you want it to be able to do in the future to support your goals. So in your slides, you have our goals and our guiding principles for this process. Funding design is a means to an end. So we really are trying to develop a funding design that ensures access to high quality care and education and supports economic development in areas of both needs, distributes funding transparently, improves quality, access, and sustainability by providing more stable resources for early childhood providers and families. That's what we're aiming for, and I think the tools that we're sharing today really are trying to do much closer to that. And then the guiding principles here are sort of how we On the next page, you see kind of an overview of our process so far. So over the last year, it's data collection and analysis. Oh, thank you. Oh, the slides here. We did some data collection and analysis, aligned on these goals and guiding principles. We conducted some focus groups with providers to get their input about how funding affects their work. We developed priorities and scenarios. we developed initial recommendations and we built out this funding model and incorporated feedback on those recommendations. So we now are kind of into the next phase of this, which is to say, okay, we have these initial thoughts, how can we refine them, how can we develop them further to make them more actionable and more responsive to what we all need. And the question that this group started with a year ago or so was really a thought experiment of what would happen if we applied the structure of the MFP to early childhood, knowing that they're very different. So there's a wider range of settings in early childhood, the mixed delivery system, the role of state and local funds is different, parent tuition, the hours and months of care and education are different, the ratios of children to adults are different. But we have a model in the MFP of a stable, predictable funding for that is year to year that schools can count on. So we talked about what elements of that structure can be adapted for early childhood and where early childhood requires a different approach. And the recommendations move us toward creating that kind of funding schematic. Some of them build on the MFP and some of them build on the. So to remind us what's in, probably this group could explain the MFP much better than we can, but just kind of remind us where it, what's in there. The MFP works by starting with the base amount per pupil, weighting that amount for different student needs, special education, economic disadvantage, other things. Then counting the students, both total number of students and the students who qualify for those different weights. And that creates the number that the state says, okay, this is what this district needs. And then there's a local contribution, which uses a formula to determine how much revenue that area can raise based on their tax base. And then the state says, okay, if it's $100, the local contribution is $35, the state puts in the other $65. And school districts receive that amount by discretion about how to use it across their schools, their programs. And this group, the feedback that we got as we worked through this together was that the first 3 steps of this actually work pretty well as far as an outline for early childhood. So having a base amount that covers kind of the cost of operating that program, weighting it based on student need, and then saying, okay, you have this many students, this is how much funding you need for those students. The local contribution piece and the allocation piece is where it looks different in early childhood based off of the history of how these systems have developed. And the structures that are already in place, and then thinking less of, there's not really a school district recipient at the local level to take those funds and use them. It's going to work directly to the programs. So this group kind of came from that to a series of recommendations around both how to implement this and what it would look like. So we're on slide 7. So one of these recommendations was around funding to strategically prioritize for increases in access over time, knowing that we're not at universal access now, prioritizing children with the most need over time, adequate funding for quality services that's aligned and sufficient across settings and parishes, and then thinking about the revenue side, sources of funding, maximizing existing funds and incorporating local contributions, and then expanding strategies that promote stability for. We'll go through these briefly. Hopefully this is familiar. Feel free to stop me if there's questions or things that sound off. Really kind of repeating back your input to you. So access piece, the commission has set a target of serving 60% of all children birth to 5 in the long run, prioritizing high poverty families in the short term. Strategically addressing gaps in access, including childcare deserts. So the strategy may not look the same across the state. There may be places where the funding needs to look different because there's not currently enough slots.
Could I ask you something?
Yeah, sure.
On that, how we strategically address gaps. Is there a plan showing what the next steps are as far as especially with rural areas that there are deserts that, I don't see new centers opening. And so how will we address that gap in access? Is there, strategically, is there a plan showing where it will be to?
It's a really good question. I think that's probably a place where we need some more thinking and input of what that really looks like. But I think one of the things we need to do is really talk to folks in those areas about what do they need to be able to address that. You know, we're not gonna necessarily be able to figure that out from a 1,000-foot view. I'm curious what other folks have thoughts about resources that we can draw from there.
I think that's work Senator Mizell that we were working on in the early childhood team in the department, so. With the additional stimulus funds and with the Ready Start networks, we've really tried to conduct some analyses of. What is preventing sites from opening? Part of our push to expand family childcare, right? Because in so many, as you know very well, in so many rural areas. It would not create a stable business model to open up a center. You know, it's small enough that there's not enough demand to be able to necessarily open a center. Or I think another model we want to use with the contracted seats, say, there is this gap in service. There is enough need to actually open a center, but you need to know that there are enough stable seats coming your way that you can afford to operate the center.
And is that being done in collaboration with workforce? I mean, is workforce, are we, I think the trip, I'm walking in late, and
No,
I'm
no,
sorry.
No, not at all.
But has workforce, in the department, like looked at an overall goal as to how to move it forward, and the workforce is looking at some collaboration with community colleges and.
Right.
Yeah,
And high schools, so
Right,
developing
right.
workforce pipelines, starting in high schools. I think there are baby steps that have started in this direction.
okay,
There's a lot farther to go,
right, yeah,
unfortunately.
yeah.
But I think that you can see in some districts, there are some models slowly being created that can be shared with other districts and hopefully gradually scale.
Right, yeah, I'd love to know what those models are, you know, that work other places, because
Washington is a
I'm down first, I'm reading the same stuff for so long. I'm
Yeah.
Incredibly frustrated.
Question, how did you arrive at the 60% target?
I believe that was something that was pre-existing.
The existing target is actually 2/3 of all economically disadvantaged children. That's what the commission has said in its reports since the start of the commission. And I was not on that first commission, but I believe some of the thinking behind that was giving families choice, knowing that not all families may want to opt into care, but that if the commission could at least determine a cost for serving 2/3 of that economically disadvantaged cohort.
Okay,
That's kind of the number that's consistently been in the commission reports each year.
What are we serving
That
now?
may be-
What's our number now?
It depends on the age, but you know, under 10% infant,
Yeah,
about 12%, 1 and 2, about 1/3 of 3-year-olds, and then 80 to 90% 4-year-olds.
2/3 of kids under 5 in Louisiana too, the Blanco Center has found has all available parents in the workforce, which I think that's also part of that indicator of the 2/3 is that, you know, 2/3 of our kids under 5 have parents that are working, so they have to go somewhere. Which probably inform that decision too.
Yeah, so these, it sounds like there may need to be some revision on these as we kind of like continue to build and I appreciate the input on that.
It's again considered myself, it's only a start, but we do now have contracted seats in 38 parishes. Not all of those are rural, but I think a goal of the department is to continue to be able to use contracted seats strategically to meet some of those access gaps in parishes.
And that's specifically if you look ahead to the strategy to promote stability, the contracted seats are definitely those because that gives that stable source of funds for providers. The funding formula really kind of, I think the place where it really comes in is thinking about adequate aligned funding across the different parishes. So following the MFP structure, this group thought that a base amount per child that covers the true cost of quality is a good place to start. And then differentiating that by child, by the age of the child and the setting, knowing that centers and homes have different costs, infant support also have different costs. Building on the recent work that's been done to align CCAP rates closer to the cost of care. Fairly funding all providers in the mixed delivery system, like speaking of the importance of homes, making sure that they're getting what they need, so that families can really choose from available options based on the type of care that works for them. And then leading those base amounts based on both child and community level needs. And this is a little different from the MFP. So the MFP really looks at like specific children. This group also thought about, to the point about, childcare desert areas, like, does it actually make sense to provide different funds or funds differently in those areas to create slots, maybe there's a need for startup funds or something like that, would look different than the kind of child by child amounts. So definitely special education is a piece, that we want to learn more about here. Families, children that are learning English, children in foster care, families experiencing homelessness are all examples of what those suites could look like. And this is a place where I think our hope for this coming year is to really do a lot more engagement and learning about what the costs really are associated with these different needs. So that we're thinking about a weight that's not just, an add-on that's like, thank you for serving this child, but is really reflective of the additional cost of serving that child, whether that's another aide in the classroom or translation of materials for families or a social worker to support, families that have other needs going on. Really thinking about what that looks like at the provider level. Thoughts or comments here?
This might not be the right place, but if we're looking at like also wanting to increase like educator compensation. Is in this section of a formula where that would live, or would that be in a different section?
Good question, and to me, that really lives in that base amount. Because when you're talking about what's the fundamental cost to operate program and serve children, the biggest cost by far is personnel, right? So, and that's where that I think really shows up. Is it coupled then with a expectation on the provider side, what they're paying, or is it just sort of giving them adequate funding to be able to pay their workforce? I think is a question. And then, sorry, do you wanna?
Oh, I was gonna say, we physically only have half the slides, so I think there was some like, oh, where is this?
Okay,
Yes.
I'm sorry.
It's-
Apologies for
Yeah.
that, because we're not sure what happened.
Yeah, so
Right.
it seems to be
I think
double sided,
there are-
one side got it wrong.
Copies.
Oh, is that what it is?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, I see, I see, that's fine, I have the black and white version, which is over there.
Okay,
Ours is
So
pretty.
our apologies, not
That's
sure
good.
how that happened.
oh,
Yeah.
there
We're all,
Very
our best here. Sorry, we switch to compensation. I think one thing we could think about in terms of the tool we're gonna look at is, could we think about different levels of base amounts that reflect different amounts of compensation, current compensation, a higher level, K-12 parity, as like, these would be different base amounts, and then we could look at what's the impact of that on the cost of the formula. That's thinking about that in other places is looked at like different scenarios for compensation. And there's a choice to be made there about what are you aiming for in compensation? Is it competitive with, the labor market, similar jobs? Is it competitive with a K-12 role, which is different in a whole bunch of ways? Work hours, benefits, all kinds of things. So I know there's other work going on workforce compensation as well, but to me, that's where that is the most natural place to kind of plug that in. Thank you. So this is really where the formula that we're gonna look at really digs in, so we can spend some more time there again.
So you call out based on child and community level. So I don't know if now is a good time to talk a little bit about how some of these might be things that make most sense to be applied at the child level versus
Yeah.
thinking about ELL, for example, where you might need to think about that at the center level rather than at child level.
Yeah, actually, I'd love to dig into that a little bit. I think there's sort of a critical mass thing, right, where you're going up enough of a population that makes sense to hire another person or that kind of thing. Versus like an individual kid who has specific needs for these materials or this, this kind of support or something like that.
Yeah, I
Spend
mean,
some time there, yeah.
well, is that something that you've already kind of got a draft of how you would currently propose to handle different dimensions like this?
No, so this is a place where I think we're hoping to build out more in the coming months with more input from the field. There are real trade-offs, right, to doing it at the center level versus the child level, if you think about like per child amount, that everyone who's serving a child who meets that criteria gets something, right? And that kind of adds up. The more, you know, the more you're doing it. On the other hand, it's certainly easier to think about costs from the center level, in terms of what programs might want or need. Projections and estimations, I guess, because you don't know exactly which children are showing up where. Right, yeah, and it could vary from year to year, month to month, right, which children you have.
How do you reach the children that are not showing up, that don't know to show up, that? How are you at the very basic level? How are you reaching people that are kind of unintentionally isolated like that? Because this is what I see more and more is that we're not. The areas that are most in need don't know where to go to have their needs met. And that's where we really change the dynamic of a lot of families that are stuck and can't improve their situation. So, I mean, that's the reality. I mean, yeah.
I do think there are techniques that we have seen have had impact.
Right.
So part of why we have a wait list now is because not only are more families eligible, but because right when we made that change in spring of 2022, we did a communications campaign, a lot of social media, and we got a much larger influx of applications. So there's many more families who we don't know yet, but I do think that if there were more funding in the future, there are techniques that we've used in the past that we could relaunch. And then that we could scale up.
Because
and
then family
more.
members can tell family members,
Yeah.
and that's the, I would think that's where
And
it's most likely.
I'm looking at staff who lead some of that work. Coordinated enrollment in communities is designed to help get out that word as well. But I think Senator Mizell, the problem is that people by now know there aren't more seats and there isn't more funding. And so I think we have multiple
But there
problems.
are people who don't know about the
services.
services.
Yes, and then people who do know about the services.
Right.
But know the funding limitations, and so I think they're not sharing about the resources with others because the resource isn't actually there.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think we have to keep exploring how do you reach every family, because of course that campaign did not reach every family, or we would have had even more applications come in. But I think we would have a starting point that we could then build off of and consult with communication experts about how do you further extend that outreach.
And meet people where they are in terms of if they're right, if they're interacting with other systems. Yeah, that also makes me think about, maybe we really have been focused on the child and program level costs here. We haven't really thought about infrastructure for the system, right? But maybe there's a need for, enrollment platform or communications campaign or something like that that could kind of go with some of these things that would be, it's common for us to spend 5 or 10% of the total cost on that kind of infrastructure. If the system scales, the infrastructure also has to scale to kind of figure out, like, before they even get to the point of I'm going to this program, how do I know what services are available and how do I find somebody who can help me within the process? There are others of these that that really jump out to you as like, this is something we should be thinking about at the community level, and childcare deserts obviously is in that category. I think that children with special needs is an interesting one as well, because often children get identified as having special needs in the course of being in early childhood. They don't come in, knowing that, right? So, but they have the need as soon as they show up, right? And so thinking about, what we built into the formula, like, what's the percentage of children in that school district that have an IEP, that special needs in the K-12 setting, which is not the same thing, but also like might maybe reflect some sort of community-wide percentage there, but that also doesn't mean that they're all necessarily evenly distributed across the programs.
So they're referred, is it first steps? Is that what I'm?
Early steps.
Early steps, yeah. Isn't that where there would be a connection made with early steps that then they would work with the special needs? Okay.
But oftentimes, they're identified in that childcare setting and then referred to early steps, so we're missing so many
So
children.
it's the cart course.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it might take a few months to go through that evaluation process and kind of get,
Would there be a mechanism in the formula to adjust the per child amount if they are identified to be a special education child over time.
To like retroactively say,
Right,
Yeah.
I mean, because the MFP has some structure where those numbers get adjusted over time.
I think they adjust it twice a year, so they count twice a year and they say,
Right.
okay, how many you have in the fall, how many do you have in the spring? So, yeah, certainly would need some kind of mechanism like that where you're sort of evaluating that. In early childhood, we count every month, right? Like we say, how many children do you have enrolled? That may or may not be efficient and stable, right? For programs. So, but yeah, thinking about, is there some kind of like in that number, do we also think about like the costs that come with certain children who haven't been identified yet? Because there are some.
And just a mechanism for mid-year adjustments within the formula that is created.
And I think, contract exceeds are not the solution to everything, but it is a model that is being pushed by the Administration for Children and Families. And so one thing that we're going to be thinking about is how to establish contracted seats specifically for young children with disabilities as well. And I think you need at least two models because families need to have choice and go where it's convenient. So they need to be able to choose, and we need to support those centers and have a formula maybe that reflects that. But we're also thinking about, how could we maybe determine centers who really already have capacity to serve young children with disabilities well and help direct some of those seats and services to those locations.
And to the point about families that don't yet know where to show up, a lot of families especially often have a hard time figuring out like who even can support.
Don't question, pardon my ignorance, does this formula contemplate like paying the full cost of care and with no out-of-pocket costs to the families, or would it contemplate some kind of sliding scale, so families who may be a little bit higher up the income scale would pay some cost of that care?
That's a good question. I actually don't think we specifically addressed that, because we were sort of focusing on economically disadvantaged as the first kind of step there. Yeah,
What's the income cutoff when you talk about economic?
I believe it's under 200% FPL is the one that has been historically used.
For the child care assistance program, it's 85% SMI state.
So those are not quite the same, but I think the commissions typically talked about under 200% MPL. Which is, I mean, depending on the size of the family, like I think typically we're not talking about a lot of cost sharing at that income level.
I don't agree forecast
Yeah.
sharing, I'm just.
No, yeah, just I can't remember exactly what the federal recommendation is, but they're definitely sort of pushing in the direction of having or have historically been, lower copays for families under certain income thresholds. And I think if you're thinking about like over time scaling up to middle income families or, a system that supports more folks, then a sliding scale starts to make a lot of sense. But I don't think we have a specific recommendation on that at this point, but we could add that.
But this contemplates, like, if you fall into that 85% category, it's free, and if you make $1 over, you're on your own.
Yeah, so I think this is where the access piece of like, increasing over time becomes a question mark becomes like that's where that starts to play in because if we're thinking about over time getting to a place where you're $1 over that threshold and you still get some assistance, but maybe you start to kick in a copay,
Right.
Then that definitely smooths that curve. We heard through this process that there are lots of folks that fall above that subsidy cutoff, but still have trouble paying for care, which I think we've all experienced, right? So that's also where this target of like.
Or they might fluctuate, I mean,
Yeah.
that's, you might fall above the threshold in one season and, a lot of
Right,
people have seasonal
right.
employment that's.
Yeah, for sure, yeah.
Just so you know, Jan, CCDF does take that kind of seasonal employment into consideration. And so it can look at an average for the year for that family, but all important consideration.
From year to year, fluctuates somebody's job or. Yeah, and it can also create these disincentives, right? If you earn $1 over the threshold, you lose your subsidy. So you're not gonna go take on, you don't want a promotion or something like that, right? Because you can hit, go back down, right?
Lose money.
Yeah.
So I guess two other thoughts in this space. It strikes me that special needs conversation earlier, the existing K-12 formula, you get additional resources to serve kids with special needs. What you're outlining is kids with special needs are frequently identified at this point, or maybe not so much later. it strikes me, and this is a dangerous suggestion, but there is some need for an incentive to do the hard work of figuring out what that special need is. And so incentives obviously drive behavior, and you don't want to over incentivize somebody trying to diagnose a child. But we also know that if a child with, any number of, issues from dyslexia to autism, et cetera, is intervened with at a much earlier stage, it is far more effective and far more cost effective. So I don't know what the right balance is there, but it strikes me that this is one of those places that actually putting some weight on incentivizing doing that work probably leads to significant long-term benefits and savings and outcomes in a positive way. So I don't know how to do that well, but
How do early steps do that? Does early steps not serve all?
Someone still has to refer to early
Right,
steps,
but
so someone has to
if-
identify
if-
that
if-
need.
If they're in
Yeah.
a situation, so if they're in a care setting, that is incumbent upon that person, right, like Michael said, to reach out to early steps. And then they would have the network for intervention and.
There are backlogs with early steps too, so pardon me, I forget, we talked about maybe Maddie, that sometimes you have to, sometimes you have to wait for that assessment to get scheduled and to happen and for services, and so certainly the more we can educate and support the field in understanding how to identify, support the faculty needs, et cetera. So one thing that, the department certainly wants to look at is supporting more developmental screening of children in sites to identify.
So,
These
but the
situations
network is
earlier.
there, we just need
Yeah.
to make sure early steps get taken on, yeah.
take on the kids through there, and there's an
Take on the
encouragement
that
for.
you're
Yeah.
talking about, right?
And, early steps is gonna push in with, speech occupational therapy, whatever, but you're still taking care of the child on all those other hours, right?
Right.
But there's definitely
Right.
still, support
Yeah,
there.
but if we get down to the brass
Yeah.
tacks of it, if I'm a center, right, and I have a kid who isn't disruptive and isn't causing problems, but might have
But there's
some sort of
lag or
issue,
something, yeah.
right? At this point, there's not, assuming the parents paying or the funds are coming, like, other than doing the right thing.
Right.
What is my encouragement to then go through all the bureaucratic hurdles to route a kid and bring it, the parent says, oh, that's a lot of headache, whatever, they're happy, right? There isn't much of an incentive other than we think it hypothetically might be the right thing.
I was, currently the CCAP program does provide a week for children with special needs, so this is not totally a new idea, but yes, it like, does that weight reflect the work and the time that's involved, right? I think it's, yeah.
Yeah, it also strikes me that incentive idea that in a place where there are deserts, that is another reasonable place that you'd want to try and think about this question of the formula ought to, having stable funding ought to drive expansion of places, but we know it doesn't, at least consistently. And so there seems to me to be some sort of argument for in places where we're dramatically under the service need to figure out how to have some sort of plus up for some amount of time that otherwise pushes attention and interest in that direction until you're getting to some reasonable share of service, at which point a normal formula kicks in.
I think it's back to what Dr. Barnes talked about, where it's like center versus child. Whereas like in a K-12 system, it's like school districts get support to deploy services across their district to support children with special needs or disabilities. And so like how would that look for early childhood, I think is a really important thing to consider in the process. And so maybe that's like maybe that's outside of this like funding formulary. But then I do think we would need to think about that as, again, to your point too, how we scale the system, we're going to need to scale the infrastructure. And so what does that look like and where does it live?
There's also a mechanism between school systems versus early learning centers, because there's more choice involved in picking where you send your child as opposed to a school system.
Right, correct. Yeah, and that comes with a lot of benefits for families and a lot of challenges for programs, right? Because they've got kids fluctuating. Yeah, and there are actually K-12 formulas that take more of a school-based approach where they look at like, these are all the costs that the school faces to take care of all these things, and therefore here's your, that's like how you get to the dollar amount as opposed to the per pupil with the weight on it. You can get to the same place either way, I think. It's just sort of a question of how you're approaching the question. All right, I'm gonna keep us moving through this because I do want to get us to the nitty gritty of the the tool, but this is a really fruitful discussion. All right. So the next piece is on the revenue side. So this is the recommendation coming out of our discussion last year was to think about how we maximize existing funding sources and incorporate local contributions. Within the existing sources, there's already a lot of good here, right? There's Head Start slots, making sure we're maximizing the use of those, continuing to promote high uptake of the LA4 program, using the federal CCDF funds to qualify for those, and then ensuring alignment to federal requirements. None of this works if it doesn't align to what the department has to do with their federal grants, so it has to kind of fit into that system. And then thinking about using the matching fund structure to incentivize contributions from parishes that have a local ability to contribute. Also implementing additional state funding in the form of like a weighted match or possibly an in-kind match for parishes with limited local ability to raise revenue. I think you all found through this matching fund process that there are some parishes that are really great about taking in local funds, some that have the capacity to do it, and some that just really don't. And so what does the local role look like for those places that just don't have the kind of base? And then wrapping state funding around to fill in those gaps. So thinking about the families that are above that CCAP threshold, the working family, the working family middle ground. That's a place where additional state funds could be really useful because they go above the federal requirements, but can reach some of those families that don't qualify.
So this is future tense or present?
Future tense. We're living in future tense today. This is I should have said that at the beginning. This is really like thinking long term about where we're trying to head as a system. This is not like short term, we're looking at the long term star kind of thinking.
This sounds very familiar. Present.
Trying to get from where we are to where we're going.
Right.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Goals unmet, that's.
yeah. And then the last piece is expanding existing strategies that promote stability. So we've been talking about contracted slots. They're a really valuable tool for thinking about stability, thinking about building supply, thinking about prioritizing groups that they have trouble accessing care, relying on local partners to inform where those go. Payment in advance, if you would get fund enrollment rather than attendance, which are aligned to federal guidance, probably a little more present tense. And then
It's gonna be difficult.
yes, yeah.
It is happening though.
Where?
This spring, so we already pay based on enrollment. And then we are moving to bring measure payment.
Position. That situation is going to make legislatively people unhappy. That we're fulfilling the incorrect information that a lot of legislators already have that we're paying people not to go to work. And that we're covering childcare. Am I misunderstanding that? That we're gonna provide payment when they don't show up, but they're enrolled? Am I understanding that?
So we do have underutilization where we remove
Right,
children if
right.
they aren't showing up at all, but
At what
Paying based
number, at what number?
if they don't sign in at all during the month period.
Oh, the whole month of the period.
Knowing that children do have illnesses that
Right,
arise, not
right.
wanting them to go to the center if they're ill, knowing that there are transportation issues. So that's.
So is it an excused or unexcused type situation, or is it just
It's
lack of showing up?
it's not really an excuse or unexcused right now, it's just that it's tracked and then they are removed from services if they aren't utilizing.
I mean,
the
I
program,
get
so
it,
that other
but
children
I'm
can't.
just saying, in the context of a conversation about this money's not going to direct,
We
that-
did
that's gonna
start
make
that
it hard.
actually. And before COVID, so
I
we've
mean-
been doing it for some time.
I actually wonder if this is a place where the K-12 analogy could be helpful. We don't pay schools based off of how many days a second grader comes to class, and we don't make them wait to get reimbursed until we see, okay, the second grader came 15 days out of 20 days in the month, and then we're gonna pay you for 15 days. We say, okay, second grader, $4,000 times this, right? And we give that to them twice a year, and we say, here's the money to educate that second grader. Because you have to pay the teacher whether the second grader shows up or not, right? You have to pay the building whether the second grader's there or not. I know, I'm not preaching the choir, but I just wonder if some of that, like, moving that frame could be helpful.
The conversations I have are, there's not even allowances made for parents who work at night who bring their kids to the daytime. They, that's, I don't.
Yeah.
Maybe it will never come up, but it just kind of jumped to me.
Yeah, and I do think that this, like, thinking of long-term, short-term, right? This is a mindset shift, in terms of how we think about what is that we're funding. It's a mindset shift from, if we're trying to build a system that is really stable and that is available for the student to the kind of early childhood education that we want to see, the purpose of it is different, right? Than you know, you're paying for the hours that the parents at work.
So I mean, two thoughts, neither of which we probably should do, but yeah, I mean, it strikes me that Louisiana is somewhat an outlier. I mean, I haven't studied this across the country, but there are any number of states that do track average daily attendance for K-12 and use that as part of their mechanism as opposed to what we do, this twice a year count, right? And that becomes, if you look at Louisiana's average attendance rate on a daily basis, it is lower than those states. Probably no surprise, right? You know, what's incentivized people do. So it strikes me that, you know, one line of argument is, okay, so we should just go move K-12 to this formula, right? Like if they don't show up, don't pay them. And I think you will get a howling from our existing systems who will say, no, that's not fair. Okay,
Right.
So why is it fair on the other side? I mean, it strikes me that you're working with kids who, frankly, you got a kindergartner who doesn't go to school or a first grader. They got to be somewhere, right? They're probably with their parent who is not then able to work. Same argument. You know, I understand there's a distinction between a 17-year-old and a 4-year-old, but you know.
But
what's
the
it-
argument across the street is not whether we're doing it the best way, it's whether the government should fund it
At all.
Sure.
And I think that plays into that argument. I totally get your point. I mean, I had a preschool, I know all of that, but it's just gonna be that.
And that'll help too, as like we inform kind of when we, this funding formulary is a long-term strategy. And we'll have to take,
Yeah.
I don't wanna
We're not
say it's
there
gonna be a paradigm shift, but it will take a shift in how we conceptualize these. So being informed by what you're hearing now really does help kind of figure out what things we need to do to lay the groundwork so that one day, you know, this is something that isn't so like strange of an idea, if that makes sense, or that sets off alarms. So Senator Mizell, your interpretations of where we are right now is super.
And these recommendations really are meant to both think about the long term and also think about like what can happen in the short term that would move us in that direction. So I think it is helpful to think about this period of time. So let's move into the funding model itself. We can circle back to this. Yes. So when we talk about a funding model, we think of a few different purposes for it. One is to come up with a statewide total funding need. So what is the target numbers? And that will vary a lot based on the population that's served, as well as assumptions that you make about how much those costs per child are, how many children are being served, and what the rates are. Another possible use of this could be to identify high priority regions for a next dollar in. So looking at the gap between current and needed funding under different scenarios, let's say we want to serve 50% of infants in care, where are those gaps the largest? And then thinking about how to kind of prioritize among those. It could be by region, it could also be by demographic group, and thinking about what those resources could be for targeted strategies, region by region. And then the last would be to estimate the cost of more specific policy proposals, like let's change the weight for special needs, or let's serve higher percentages of specific population, and think about what those policy actions could be. If let's say we have X dollars more this year, what could we do with that? You could look at different scenarios of what the impact of that would be. So those are kind of the goals of the tool. And I'd love for you all to think about like what your examples things might be as we kind of go through this, so we can think about like, is that something the tool could do now, or is it something we would need to build in? I want to be really clear that a model is a tool. it relies on good inputs to generate good outputs. See, it's like fortunately kind of small on the bottom, but like all the things the funding model is not. A model is not gonna tell you what to do. It's a tool that you can use to evaluate different ideas, but it's not a replacement for judgment, values, and insight of people in the field or people in this room. It doesn't mean you get to skip engaging with the field because it really needs good data and input as the basis for the conclusions. Shouldn't be used by itself, it's to be used alongside other inputs. Generally, this is not something that you're gonna like post on the website and like let anybody kind of go in there on. It's not really public facing, it's more an internal document for the key decisions. But that said, it's good to be transparent about what it's telling you. And the more confident we are in those data and those assumptions and those decisions, the more confident we'll be in the outputs.
I'm back on, previous.
Yeah.
And maybe it's just something that, in like, global way we're looking at this, under the identify high priority regions for next dollar in. And it says group regions by needing resources or target strategies. I would love to know, and maybe we don't have to talk about it now, but what is defined as need and resources? Like, is need more seats or is need, we need to increase workforce access, we need to create a workforce, and this is a first step toward creating a, workforce, engagement, where there's like, where people can't go to work, and, I think of it like DOTD either putting more lanes on a very high traffic area or creating a road where there's no road at all. Some of this has to balance between building more lanes and putting a road where there's no road. Some of these regions that are really devastated with the state. And Karen, I've talked to you about this. I just don't want us to, in building out structure that already exists, to forget where we need to put structure that is not there. So I'd really love to know how you're defining needed resources.
Yeah, and the answer really is that that's something that like you as the user of this can look at different. That's something that like you get to bring into this, right? It's to say like my priority today is to look at areas where we're currently serving the lowest percentage of children. Those are the areas I want to prioritize. Or I want to look at areas that have the highest percentage of children or highest number of children in poverty, right? Those would lead you to different places, and that those are things that you can use this to kind of like look at what it would mean to prioritize one of those for the next dollar in versus the other one, what the cost would be, what the distribution.
I just feel like we have an
Yeah.
opportunity
Yeah.
within this
Yeah,
to create cultural shifts in places that desperately need a cultural shift. And if we leave those areas out, because it's gonna be building up from ground zero, then we're missing a huge opportunity.
yeah, I appreciate. Yeah, that can be defined a lot of different ways. Yeah.
This makes me think, it's another idea I was kind of thinking about, and I think it applies very much to this, but it might also be part of the general strategy on funding. So we've got an idea of a formula, but we might wanna pursue this conversation with the idea of two general ways that we fund things through the formula, and then we have grant programs, or supplemental funding or something.
Yeah.
And that might be a place where we intentionally set aside, new growth areas.
Yeah.
There's gonna be something that can be paired with an
Yeah.
economic development incentive to sort of spark
Yeah.
development in an area, and you're gonna get a big employer. And we're gonna make sure that we introduce new childcare support right near that.
Right.
Yeah.
Because the rural areas are where a lot of the new growth is.
Yeah.
I mean, and they're ill-equipped or much less for people who come in from more urban experiences with options.
And this general idea, I was already thinking of it for a different application, but I think it works really well there. And the other application is thinking about that. Some of these examples we talked about before, you have to kind of get some economy of scale. If we give funding to a district for K-12 to support special needs or English language learners, very often that district will take that money and focus most of it in a single school and say, all the kids who need this come to this one place.
Right.
Doesn't really work at a childcare center.
Yeah.
But you might have a grant program that says, we've identified this area as an area that has this certain amount of need. You can apply for the grant program so that you can create a high capacity center to serve that type of student. As sort of a parallel funding mechanism that sits right alongside the formula, but think of it as part of the formula. But it's functionally really different from being like a student by student or center by center thing.
Yeah, and you know, K-12 as well, they're like, not all of the funding goes through the formula, right? So you can definitely have things that are outside of that. I'm also thinking about like one of the advantages of formula is sort of the automatic nature of it, and in a grant model, you can think of that as almost like a non-competitive grant, right? Like anybody who meets these criteria can qualify for this, which you have to have a really clear set of criteria to know how much, who would qualify, who would do it, right, to be able to fund that, but that could be another way to think of it more formulaically, right? Like anybody in this situation can qualify for this startup funding or whatever, but not being on a per child basis necessarily, because you don't necessarily have the children yet, and we're gonna get that. Yeah, no, of course. These are really good discussions, so I'm really grateful for the engagement. Okay, I'm gonna walk you through how it works and then we'll look at it. And I'm like I'm building it up like it's an Excel doc, don't get too excited. Okay, so there's three main components here. There's how many children, what's the cost, and then what's the gap. The first part is how many children. So the model has baseline data in there, just like the number of children in each parish by each age group and by poverty level, so 0 to 100%, 100 to 200, and then above 200. That's just census data. We're using right now number of children with special needs from the percentage of children with special needs in the MFP for that district, for that parish. That could change. That's a play. I think based on our conversation today, it makes me think we probably want to lean more toward that early steps number. And then the user enters the percentage of children that you want to serve in each age group and income level. So for instance, what if you said, you know, I want to serve 50% of infants and 1-year-olds under 100% FPL, moving up the scale for different age groups, and then, you know, maybe I want to serve 10% of children over 200% FPL. That's like one scenario you could look at. And then from there, it's just a multiplication, right? Percentage of children served by the total children in each parish using that criteria. And so that would give you total children served by parish, by each age group, and then by each age level, as well as statewide. Next piece is cost. This is a place where I think we can do a lot of refinement, so it's pretty high level right now. And there's a lot we can learn here, and just like refinement and being more specific. So base cost per child, right now we have two options in there. One is the LPIC cost model that they did a couple of years ago, which looks at center-based costs, and then we adjusted that for home and school-based settings. And then the CCAP rates, which also looked at cost as part of developing them, which included different rates for home, center, schools, and military settings. And then you can also choose to use a percentage of either of those models. So let's say you want to think about like, how do we get from point A to point B? You could say, what if we tried to get to 80% of the cost model or 90% of this, or if we wanted to go above the CCAP rates, what if we did 110% of the current, those kind of things. So you can vary them a little bit there. I think to the question about wages, this is a place where we could get more specific about what wages are reflected in each of those models and how they might change if we were to sort of update that or think about different wage benchmarks. And then that's multiplied by the number of children served in each age group and setting. We use the distribution of children by setting based on CCAP data. Right now, the vast majority of kids who receive CCAP are in centers. I think that's something that like probably doesn't 100% reflect where kids really are. Probably reflects access to CCAP more than other things. So that's another place that could be updated. And then weights, the user can enter weights for different populations. Right now we have special needs, English language learners, economically disadvantaged, rural areas, and the quality level of the program. Build it more here, and then that's multiplied times the base cost. And we don't at this point have like recommendations for what those weights should be, but are interested in doing more engagement this year to learn more about like what the costs are associated with each of these criteria. And add it all up to get to the total. throw a lot at you there. Questions? And then the last piece is the gap, is just the gap, which is a subtraction problem essentially, but the data is important here. So we have current funding and slots by parish based on aggregating data across early Head Start, CCAP, LA4, this acronym is wrong, I'm sorry, non-public schools, ECE fund and Beta 3. One of the challenges here, which is not unique to Louisiana, this is in every state I've worked in, it's hard to figure out children who are using multiple slots. So if they're in a pre-K program and they're using CCAP for aftercare or Head Start and something else, it's very hard to identify that that's the same child using 2 slots. So we're using slots rather than kids, and that's just a limitation of the data. Some programs data was not available for building this. So for instance, Title I pre-K programs, which are district by district, we have the numbers on them. And then, so you have your desired cost based on your inputs for how many children you want to serve and at what cost, minus the current funding. That gives you a funding gap, right? Of what that parish would need to get to the desired that you're putting in. We also have in there parish's ability to contribute local funds through the MFP's formula for local contributions. It's pretty comprehensive. It looks at a lot of different types of property and other kinds of tax bases. So it kind of gives us a sense of like, is this a high capacity parish or a low capacity parish? I don't know that we're advocating for like the parish should put in exactly what they put in the MFP. That's probably not right. But it kind of gives us a sense of which parishes are have more resources to contribute. And then the slots gap, very similar, slots needed based on the number of children in the parish at various income and age levels and what you put in, or what children you want to serve, minus the current slots. A lot of imperfection here. I would not walk out of here and use this formula to make decisions, right? There's a lot here that like needs to be refined and tweaked over time. But I think that's the basic structure. So we'll look at it, I'm gonna pull up the Excel, and my questions for you are, what questions are you hoping this tool will help you answer? What's missing? What else should be included or presented? What concerns do you have? And just thinking about, how much you wanna use this. And I have this like big caveat that like, this is an early draft, this is for discussion. Don't walk out of here and say the formula said this, right? Because these are preliminary and subject to change. But I think like what I'm really interested in getting your input on the structure of it, and does this work for the kinds of questions that you want to answer, and where you want to go with it. So. Reshare so that I'm showing the thing to them. Oops. Okay, I think we're good. All right, so this is the summary page, which has the inputs that we just talked about. So the inputs for the number of children served, what you want the weights to be, and which base cost you want to use. I've set it right now to like roughly what the current percentage of children served is. We grouped together under 100 and under 200% because they're kind of grouped together in most state programs right now. So you can see we're doing a pretty good job serving 4-year-olds, less so with infants and 1-year-olds. And if you go down here, you see what the funding needed is, or what the current funding is, and then what the desired funding is. And you can see that they're pretty close together right now because I've set it to basically what we're already doing, right? So it's about 564 million. Of that, about 336 million comes from federal. Most of the rest is state. There's 20 million or 23 million coming from local. So this is like status quo. Right? what you can use this to do is say, okay, I wanna bump infants up, let's say incrementally, we wanna get infants and 1-year-olds closer to where 2 and 3-year-olds are, so let's try to get them to 20% served. Changing nothing else, you can see what that increase is in terms of funding that would be needed to do that. So that's just taking that number of infants and 1-year-olds times the cost per child, and sort of increasing that number.
Tell me again, how many children are we talking about for that 563?
So. Here, I'll go back. About 55,000. That's not about right.
Well, right, just a quick question on that, because you called out the potential kind of overlap there, where you might have people in one program during the day and another. So could you look at least some picture of how many kids served by all these programs are in that program on a part-time basis? Do something, because I guess part of what I'm thinking is the budget numbers logically fit together pretty well to me, but the number of children served, I feel like we would really want to budget for more like 1.2 or 1.3. The
Right,
number of kids actually
Of slots,
served.
right, in
Yeah.
order to get to the number of
Slots.
kids. Yeah, I think that's right. We can think of these as slots rather than children, is probably
Yeah.
probably more accurate way to think about it right now. Yes, I think that is something that we would love to refine with future data in this model, is really looking about, we know for CCAP, part-time and full-time, we could usually is tracked that way. And then for
And that might be-
Head Start and pre-K, I don't know what data is available on how many of those slots are half day. You're shaking your head. They're all full day. Okay, great.
Well, there's 6 hours.
Right, so, but how many of those kids are using before and after care? I mean, that's harder to, we maybe could look at how many programs offer that as a way to, get at it, but I think you're right, that we probably, like, if we're trying to serve, 100,000 kids, we probably want to budget for 110 or 120,000 slots, right, because some of those are per day. Great, okay, so another thing we can do with this is we can look at what the impact of weights would be. So the NFP's weight for children with disabilities is much higher. I think it's like 150%. Doing that from memory, so somebody in the room, thank you, Addie. So you can see what the impact of, like, if we kept the number of children served the same, but we just increased this weight for children with disabilities, you can see what the budget impact of that would be, and what the gap would be. So that's actually like pretty expensive, even for a pretty small number of children. That's looking at estimated by how many children receive that weight in the MNP, so that might change if we change that assumption. And so you can play with the different weights here. You can also look at, well, okay, what if we went to the LPIC cost model instead? What's the impact of that? What if we went to 80% of that cost model? So you can kind of play around with different changes here to see what the impact on the cost would be. And then this is where you see that gap, which is just the difference between the current and the desired. And then the other thing you can play with is, what if we have the local contribution? So what if we said we actually want localities to contribute 15% instead of 4%? And we also built in an employer share here too, which is not something that we have specifics around, but it's something that a lot of states are exploring. What if we wanted employers to kick in 5% of the cost? What would that look like? And what effects that then have on the state share? What they do from the state level as you think about these, fairly expensive new directions. Thinking about what other revenue sources might help to share that burden. We kept the federal constant on the assumption that that is not in our. So I'll stop talking for a second and let folks kind of take that in, and then I'm happy to, somebody has an idea for what if we did this, to see if we could do it with this as it's built right now. Looking at just the statewide piece.
I feel like the formula could also look at a subset of children and funds, so that employer contribution, for example, I can't imagine that there would be an employer contribution for every single economically disadvantaged child, but it could be that there could be a separate program developed that included an employer contribution, so something that's not rolling into your total.
Into the total, but is yeah, I mean, I think if we were thinking about that as being part of the total of kids served. One of the things we have now is we have this organized by parish. And I think there could be another way to organize it too, that's more around like different groups of children who meet different criteria, so. Children in employer program, children in Head Start, children in different demographic groups or something like that, where we can sort of look at like, what if we wanted to increase the percentage for this demographic group specifically? What would the impact of that be?
If I'm like a parish leader and I want to see if I could get like 5% of employer input into investment. And I was doing cost modeling using this tool. Me changing it on this main page would still change it on my parish amount too, right? Or how does that work?
Yeah, so let's go to the parish. So this tab is like way overwhelming, so I'm sorry. But this is the parish by parish tab, and what this has is it has the projected. So right now it's set to like status quo, basically, right? So it has the total cost that would be projected and the total current funding, and estimated current slots, and then an estimated gap. You'll notice some of these are like in the green and some are in the red. I would look at that as like a comparison of how each of these parishes is doing compared to the state average. So if the state average is we're serving 15% of 1-year-olds, is the parish serving more than that or less than that? Is kind of what this is showing you right now. And so yeah, so they can look at like what that would look like, what their funding gap is. I think we actually don't have on here how much of their funding is coming from state and local. We can certainly add that, yeah. So let's say you're looking at Acadia Parish, which is our first row here. The projected, we show that they would, based on what we put in, that they would want to serve about 1,000 children, and they're currently serving 771, or have that many slots. And their funding gap is about 3.7 million to get from where they are to like where the state average is. So that, which is about 234 slots. So we can see like what that is as a percentage of their population. It has total children. And then we can also look at their MFP contributions, which is on the low end. So that's 24% is what they're supposed to put in for the MFP. So this is a parish where they're a little below the state average. They have a gap of slots and they have a low expected contribution for the MFP. So it's probably not a parish that would be a super high target for NEC matching fund, maybe a little bit, but it's probably not a place where that's going to be the main strategy. So that might be a place to say, okay, this is, thinking about our next dollar in, right? Are there parishes like this that are below where the state is and that don't have a lot of local resources to draw from? That might be a place to target for contracted slots or that kind of thing. Then you might look at a parish that's in the green, Allen, which is right below it. They're a little above the state average. They also have a low MFP contribution, but they're currently doing a little better at serving the percentage of children in their area. If you go back and you change the percentage of children you want to serve, like let's say we put this really high, and we said we wanted to serve 50% of children under poverty, you'll see that changes a little bit, right? Now they're actually still doing pretty well. But you see more parishes that are in the red in terms of not meeting that target.
Can you go down a little further to that?
Yeah. We can also filter. What do you want to look at?
Washington, you could go down.
Let's look at Washington.
I can't help myself.
Yeah, no, that's also. Yes. Can you read it? Is it big enough?
Yeah.
Okay, great. What do you want me to set it up?
Just let me take
Yeah.
it.
Great.
And do you want it at the current?
So
level?
the slot gaps, in my understanding, at population 7%, so we've got the slots gap of 191, that's slots.
Yeah.
That have been sought after, or that's the population of children are not being met?
So it's based on what you put in over here. So I put in, let's serve 50% of children under poverty.
And you know that number?
No, I'm making this up. So
No,
yeah.
I mean, I know you make
Yeah.
the 50, but I mean, the 191.
Oh yes, we know the number of children under poverty. Yes.
That's
Yeah.
crazy to me.
Well, it's still an estimate, isn't it?
It's an estimate, yeah,
Yeah.
it's census data,
Based
so,
on just
so
the
it's.
percentage of people in poverty in the parish as a whole.
I believe the percentage under poverty, they do break it down by children under 5. I think for 100 to 200%, we had to do some math to get that, but it's, I mean, it's gonna change year to year, right? Like, it's not exact, but like, but census data gives us pretty good numbers on children under 5 and children in poverty. It's different than the total population in poverty, because people are, yeah, but do you wanna put different numbers here?
No.
Okay. We'll just, okay, do you wanna put it current, or? 'Cause we can also look at what's, yeah.
You just had me on the numbers thing.
All right, yeah, so I think like the projected here is what's determined by what you put in, right? So this is saying what the need based on what you put in on that first
What's
step.
the closest to? I mean, I could play with this all day, but what's the closest to the reality?
Yeah, so let's put it at current.
Because we, just as an example, if we have universal pre-K, our 4-year-olds have access to school. This
Right.
the infant to 3s that.
Yeah. Yeah, so currently, about 776 slots and about 8.3 million in Washington Parish. Those are numbers that reflect reality, right? That's based on our best
Right.
estimate, right? This is, if you were like doing what the state average is, you would need 692 slots, so you're a little ahead, right? You've got about 84 more slots than that it would say that you need based on the state average, right?
Are we gonna have a link to this?
We can share this with the task force if that, I'm comfortable with that if you all are. I would say like, my general request about this is like, let's keep it within folks who had this introduction to it and not share it out. I'm always like, please don't post on Facebook, because like, it's still early draft, we're still playing with it. Also, you could put all kinds of things in here and see, and that's great to do while you're playing with it, but I just wouldn't want it to be misleading for folks.
Because I think it would really help to see those parishes where the numbers were more positive. What do they do?
What are they doing?
Right.
Yeah. And what do they have in common? And where are they, right? Like, are like, yeah, I think that's a great use of this as well, is to see, which parishes are a little ahead. How are they doing? And then if parish by parish, they wanted to set a target, like we are trying to serve this, right? They can look at what their gap is to get there, and what they what they would need age group by age group, to get there.
It's encouraging to see that like Washington Parish is ahead of the state average, despite having according to the MFP contribution, a low contribution. And based off what I know from my neighboring parish where I live, it's exciting to see that. So then again, my question is like, what is it universal pre-K that helps us get to that amount? And it'd be cool to see like what's underneath that is like where the kids in this, age 2. Class age 1, okay. I'm trying to like, in what age group are they particularly ahead of the curve?
Yeah.
Right, we know that they're ahead of the curve according to the state average, but which age group is it?
Right, is it all, we're doing really, really well serving our 4-year-olds, but still don't have a lot of infant care, or is it actually distributed across? Yeah, so it would be helpful to have the current funding and slots broken out a little more age group by age group, potentially, and the current funding, like, is it, we have really successful Head Start programs, or is it like we have a really successful local contribution, or all of the above?
Maybe that's comparison to the state average for each age group.
Yeah, or like what that gap is. Right, yeah. And then also thinking about, I just lost my train of thought. Oh, what those parishes have in common? Is it that the parishes that are ahead of the state average are all PCE fund, matching parishes, or are they places where they've been more successful figuring out federal dollars? Like, what's the commonality, or is it not a commonality, which actually might not be, and that's actually good, right? There's lots of paths to get there. We'll look at any other. Who else want to do theirs?
Focus on eyebrows, Stephen. You could ask whatever questions you have in the next 7 minutes.
I'll just say this tab does break it down a little bit more on the cost side of like, how are we getting to these costs? So base and then each of the weights by each of the age groups. So if you wanted to like get more into the what is the cost of quality piece of this, you could look at that. And just or you the file when you get it, so there's an index here that kind of talks through like what each of the tabs does, the data sources, where we're getting each of these. I know there's some real data experts in this room, so if you're looking at this, you're like, oh, there's a better source for that, like please send it our way. And then we have like just like different inputs of like where these things are coming from in terms of the census data and everything else. So again, if you want to get in the weeds, go for it, but no pressure. I can't get back to where I was there. So we'll send this around, and we'd love for you all to play with it and tell us what's wrong with it and tell us what else you'd like to see. And we've got some good ideas coming out of this. My other question for this group, just in our last few minutes, is, you know, what other who else should we be talking to, and what other kind of directions do you want to see this go? Go back to the slides. A few things that we've talked about and we already have on our list is thinking about mapping those funding and slot gaps across the state, identifying parishes with both, that could be good matching funds targets, could be places for enhanced state investment, thinking about what the financial impact of different decisions would be. We have a couple of other things on our list. We want to do some engagement with providers on some of these things around what their costs are, and pressure test this with other leaders in the field. But yeah, I'm curious from your all's perspective, who else should be weighing in on this, and what other information should we be looking at? About building this in something that could be used for now.
Local economic development groups need to know.
Can you say a little more about?
Well, I mean, everything in creating a workforce is based on availability. Without really care, it's not gonna happen.
Thinking about like their parish specific.
Right, yes,
Yeah.
I mean, I know workforce and LED is already aware of it, but the local people where they could, build up support for local investment need to know how critical this is to the next step of development. So.
Thinking about maybe like slightly more user friendly version of, like their parish's numbers that we can sort of use this to put together.
Well, I think people they're not gonna care about the quality of childcare, they're not gonna care about all that. They're just caring about getting bodies into economic developments that they want to bring in, and that's the only way it's gonna happen. So the approach is gonna be different, but still, you're all gonna end up with the same thing. Some parish got to make the investment.
Yeah, I wonder, that makes me wonder, like, if there's a group where we can pressure test, like, do these slot needs correlate with what your workforce needs are? Like, are you hearing about this number of parents saying, I can't go to work because I don't have childcare? Cause I wonder if that kind of would help.
And to your point about like what are the age groups, right? Like maybe yeah, we can get preschool if they're 4, like I can't find a slot for my infant or for my child with special needs, right? Like those things. I'm almost envisioning like a little tool where they can say like, here's my parish, and here's how many children I'm serving by age group, and here's how many I want to serve. Like
Who would use that tool?
there was something to bring into a meeting with a
Oh,
like as
okay,
opposed to
so
this giant
say-
spreadsheet, right? Yeah.
Nobody I know that is, that needs to be incredibly aware of what we're
Yeah.
talking about, would ever go to a website.
Sure,
and
no,
go
I'm just
to
thinking
the
like,
tool.
if you're walking
There's
into a
not.
meeting with the local economic
Right,
development person,
no,
something
I-
you can bring
I
with
get
you,
it,
right,
I
to
get
say,
But it's, to me, it's as basic as how many single mothers go to a community college and walk away because they know they don't have childcare and that they're lost to the workforce at that point. So there's something really basic to the needs that this meets that I don't think we're speaking to. I don't mean in this
Yeah.
room, I mean
Generally.
in our conversation.
I think related, I want to go back to the idea I floated about thinking about full-time, part-time as a way. It may be more a matter of kind of rebasing where we start, which is to say, right now, we know that there are some kids who are using accommodate, two of these programs. But a lot of this is saying if we want to expand capacity, we might be thinking all the expanding capacity as serving full-time needs.
Yeah.
So it may just be something we want to correct on the front end, and it could in fact mean when we say, where do we think the gaps are today? Gaps are probably a little bit worse because the number of families that are actually being supported.
Right.
It's not quite as large as what adding up all those numbers suggests, so that might be like a one more important kind of rebasing before we start circulating this more widely.
I think that's right, and then also thinking about when we think about that base cost, like that it might look different than the base cost today. The base cost today is based on a 6-hour day, for instance, and we know that's not what.
Right.
Yeah. Right, yeah, there's some are, yeah.
Leave early.
Thank you very much. Other things, close minds? So I'm happy to both like take brilliant thoughts that occurred to you all after you leave here, which I know sometimes I'm like, oh, that's what I should have said, like 2 hours later, 4 days later, whatever it is, the story. While you're walking your dog on Sunday morning, you're like, I have a great idea about this, like, let me know, don't keep it to yourself. Make sure that we send out contact info. And I'm also happy to if you wanna spend some time going through this in more detail, one-on-one or with somebody else and your, colleague, you want to bring somebody else into it, I'm happy to jump out as you and do this. Also just want to ask how this group wants to be engaged in the next part of the process. I've been talking about some future directions that we're thinking about with this. And I'm curious, do you all want to, I think one thing we're thinking about is if we do some provider focus groups, to bring those results back to you all and share what we hear from that. But the other things that you all want to be engaged in, that's, really our kind of main guiding body on this work, for over the years. So make sure that you're really in the driver's seat on this process and, the response to that. They really feel on that's great.
No, I mean, I would love us to hear the Secretary of Workforce. I would love us to hear from I know she's engaged about this. I think it would be helpful to see it from the other side of the coin that, to kind of get some direction on what she sees as short-term needs that are being limited because of the lack of childcare. I mean, I don't know if that even. But I think we kind of get into our bubble, frankly. It's outside the bubble.
To that point, it would be, to me, part of the conversation would be if there are identified federal funding sources or grant sources that she has a workforce commission that could somehow tie into this funding model that could help finance pieces of the funding model.
Yeah, because I know she's trying to start a pilot program for community colleges. And I don't know what the name of the program was, but we talked about it last year. She was getting funding specific to childcare startups in the community college, which would be a workforce training center for students at the community college. So it's like a win-win situation. So I don't know what the status of that is. I haven't talked to her lately.
It just seems like there's gotta be some financing piece over there that could somehow be connected to this, and help be a funding source for a right, some capacity.
It also sounds like there's an interest in this group on thinking about startup and supply building. in like areas that kind of don't have a lot of access to that, which is probably
Right,
a little
right.
different from this formula approach, but maybe like a place for a deeper dive conversation.
I mean, to build upon that, it sounds like if I were sort of making suggestions to people to weigh in, so I think you got workforce, but I'd also say economic development seems to, it's sort of a
Right.
chicken and egg kind of thing.
Right.
So I think there's some level of weighing in there. I'm thinking about the Policy Institute's group of business, I guess, Business Advisory Council. You've got a set of businesses that already said they're interested. You get 3, 4, 5 of them who have real workforce insight to sort of weigh in that space. You start getting some sampling there. And then I don't know how to deal with that question you noted of, growth in areas that don't have it. There are some efforts underway, but they tend to be the Ready Start network, so I imagine are already sort of tied in somewhere. But I think some constellation of those people ought to sort of pressure test and say, this is a nuance that's missing. Because I do think there's little pieces that are missing, but I mean, directionally, my take is this is in the ballpark to start having conversations. Again, with an understanding that it doesn't capture everything.
That's right.
We had a great, remember the guy from our peds? Incredible, just to hear what one parish did to, I mean, we've all heard that, I guess, but I mean, I think that was kind of gave us an expansion to how we see this, that's impossible, so, yeah.
I think the question there would be like, what are the needs that they've identified that a funding formula approach could support or not, or that would be outside of that, but like, what are the sort of funding? If we wanted to scale that kind of like local investment leadership, to build supply, like what does that look like? What would have been helpful to them? What do they need?
I mean, to build off of that, many of those are connected to that Ready Start network, but it strikes me that reaching out to Rapides, Shreveport, New Orleans, your 2 or 3, 4 places that have actually invested substantively already and say, okay, here's how your investments are playing through this formula. What does this make you think? Does that reflect it accurately?
Yeah.
Does this beg other questions? Because those are sort of the real leaders so far in terms of bulk value.
And I think, when we talk about next dollar in and that kind of thing, we also want to make sure that we're not disadvantaging the places that have been investing, which has been a really clear direction for this group as well, that to say like, just because you're doing well, doesn't mean that like, you don't have needs, right? Yeah.
Because nobody said it, this is like a great start, like, it's really cool.
You got to play around with, so
Yeah.
it's well done.
Appreciate that, thanks. I think I would have known if you guys were unhappy with it, so. To me, like, lots of questions is like that's the kind of feedback I'm always excited to get, so. Okay, well, I think that's what I've got, so. Randy, might be-
All right, well, thank you so much, Abby. Really appreciate that. And to echo Abby, I really appreciate the engagement and rich discussion. Very interesting model and lots of nuance we can do. So just FYI, the Early Childhood Care and Education Commission is meeting on Tuesday, March 25th at 1 p.m. in the Thomas Jefferson Room. Some of you are members, all are welcome to attend as members of the public as well. And we're going to be having someone from Michigan presenting the Tri-Share model, which is a model in which there are contributions from the employer, the employee, the parents, and the state. So that might be a model of interest to hear about. And thank you very much again for attending today, for your engagement. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, let's meet you, so McCartney. Give you my email, if you have other thoughts after. I'll look up physical part.